This is the lecture for European history for Tuesday, the 17th of May, 2022. And what we have just done is we have seen three movie clips. The first clip is from the film Bataan, made in 1943 while the war was still going on. In fact, while the war was still very much in doubt. And the last scene is of the sole survivor of an American unit that was tasked to defend a bridge against Japanese attack in Bataan. And the sergeant's last moments were moments of absolute defiance, which is designed to encourage the people of a nation at war to fight, which is what needs to happen. I honestly wonder if we get involved in a war today, whether Hollywood has the guts and the good sense to make war movies that will help Americans pursue the war to victory. I don't know. They certainly did not do that during Vietnam. The second was a clip from the movie The Cruel Sea, which is based on a novel by Nicholas Montserrat, who served on Flower-class corvettes during the Second World War for the British. Here's a quote from the book. This is about the Battle of the Atlantic. "The men who manned these ships were cast in the same mold. For sailors, the Battle of the Atlantic was becoming a private war. If you were in it, you knew all about it. You knew how to watch keep on filthy nights, how to surmount an aching tiredness, how to pick up survivors, how to sink submarines, how to bury the dead, and how to die without wasting anyone's time." It's not sentimental. Very matter of fact. And the movie that was made is, again, one of the best war films, I think, ever, because it shows the matter-of-factness of war. It's not grand opera. It's a job. It's life or death. It's got consequences, but there's only so much opera the human nervous system can take. It's a job. And the men who fight the war do it as a job. The last clip was from Das Boot. The captain of the U-boat is trying to do something unusual. Pass by the British base at Gibraltar at the mouth of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. And the British have so many defenses against submarines traveling underwater that he decides to pass on the surface. Now, in World War II, submarines were not like nuclear boats today. They were submersibles. They traveled very slowly when underwater for limited periods of time. On the surface, they could travel much more quickly, and they had as much endurance as their fuel and food would allow. So traveling on the surface was a gutsy move, but you saw in the end they got hit by shell fire or close enough to wound somebody pretty badly, and they dived in an uncontrolled way. Now, when a German U-boat dived, all of the crew ran forward into the nose of the vessel in order to give it extra weight and give some momentum so that the U-boat can dive in a matter of seconds. That's very important. Otherwise, they get destroyed on the surface. And U-boats were better than any other navy in the world at submersing their submarines quickly. They were designed for it. But the submarine was out of control after that. They couldn't get the control back. They tried moving the men to the back of the boat. It was like an aircraft in a terminal dive. Now, the thing about water is it's denser than air. So, in that middle clip, what you saw was hedgehogs, which shot the little bombs out off the side of the ship, and depth charges, which were ash cans filled with explosives and a pressure gauge, rolled off the rear of the ship. At a predetermined depth, the hedgehogs and the depth charges will explode. Now, an explosion underwater has a lot more force than an explosion in the air. If you have a grenade go off near you, unless you're hit by the shrapnel, the concussion's probably not going to bother you very much, unless you're right on top of it. But if you're underwater, I mean, hell, people fish with dynamite when they're not being sportsmen, when they're just trying to eat. You can drop a grenade in a lake and kill a whole bunch of fish because the blast effects are so much greater in the denser medium of water. So when depth charges go off and hedgehog bombs go off, they can crumple a U-boat's hull. That's what they're for. And that's what happened in the middle clip. They crumpled the U-boat's hull. And what you saw was air, oil, and debris. Sometimes the Germans would put oil into the water and shove some debris into their torpedo tubes and push it out with air pressure to try to fool the British or the Americans into thinking that the U-boat was sunk when it really had not been sunk. But in this case, the U-boat dealt with another problem. A man-made object that's going to contain human beings is basically a hollow tube of steel. And the thing about water is it's not only denser than air, it gets denser the deeper you go. So all man-made vessels have a pressure depth beyond which they go at their peril. When you heard the sounds of gunshots in that submarine as it was nearing the bottom, those weren't gunshots. Those were gauges coming off pipes, firing with the speed of a bullet because the pressure was so great. When you saw the men going, what that was the air pressure getting so great that eyeballs and eardrums were close to popping. Talking massive changes in air pressure. Because what the ocean wants to do, well, nature abhors a vacuum, and it wants to crush that vessel, implode it. Germans and Americans and Japanese actually were and British actually, if you're going to build submarines, you better build with a bunch of extra tolerance, just in case your submarine has to go deeper than you expect. But you never know. You never know. The submarine goes underwater, it may never come up again. If the machine doesn't work properly, if the fail-safes and backup systems don't work properly, you could be in Davy Jones' locker for the rest of your life, which won't be very long, if it implodes. And what's worse, actually, is if it doesn't implode, but you can't get off the bottom, or you can't get back to the surface, then you die in basically a steel coffin with a bunch of other men. So let's get to what this is all about. We had brought things to the fall of Bataan and the Philippines and Japanese expansion and up to Operation Torch. Operation Torch is a turning point thing, so I'll get to that later. Okay, we're now in 1942. 1942 is the year that the war changed. From 1939 through 1941, into 1942, the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy were winning. It was a rare moment when the Allies had any joy at all. In 1942, you have the fulcrum of battle, tipping and tilting. So there are a series of turning point battles that we're going to look at. And the first of them is the longest battle of World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic begins on the first day of the war, and it ends on the last day of the war. So it's basically from September 1939 through May of 1945. In every one of those months, there is battle. What's the point of the battle? To starve the island of Britain of resources and of food. Just like in World War I, the Germans understood that the British have far too dense a population to feed based on local resources. Also, British industry was very important to the Allied war effort. And Britain was where America was going to stage its army for the invasion of Europe. If you can make Britain uninhabitable by starving its people, you can win the war. And all you have to do is sink more Allied ships than they can replace. If you can sink more tonnage of Allied ships than they can replace, you win. If they can build more tonnage than you can sink, you, as the Germans, will lose. This is the only thing that kept Winston Churchill up at night after the invasion threat to England passed. He wasn't worried about anything else, not the Blitz of London, not the battles in North Africa. I mean, obviously he cared. He wanted to win. He was deeply committed to victory. But he really believed that sooner or later America would come into the war. And actually, once Hitler attacked Russia, Churchill prayed a Thanksgiving prayer to God because Hitler attacking Russia was a suicidal move, and Churchill knew it. You see, when France fell in 1940, June of, Britain was alone. Nobody else was fighting the Germans. For an entire year, from June of 1940 until June of 1941, Britain was alone. The Russians were German allies. The Americans were neutral. They were supplying Britain with money and war supplies, but the American people did not want to go to war. It wasn't until the Japanese sneak attack and Hitler's subsequent declaration of war upon the United States that Americans were willing to go to war. And then we wanted to win with a vengeance because of the dastardly nature of the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor and because of things like the Bataan Death March. But the thought of Britain being starved to death. So, I should continue. When Russia entered the war unwillingly because of German betrayal, Churchill was pleased because the British Empire and the Russians had a chance of stopping the Germans. And when the Americans were brought into the war by the Japanese, Churchill was even more pleased because there's no way a continental power like Germany can beat basically a medium-sized nation like Germany, even if it controls the rest of Europe, can beat a continental power like the Soviet Union, a continental power like the United States, and the international British Empire. It just won't work. Churchill knew this. But even with all of that, had Britain been starved to death, it would have been a disaster. So the Battle of the Atlantic is the English and eventually the Americans versus the Germans. And it's about getting supplies to Britain, and for the Allies, and for the Germans, it's about sinking tonnage of ships. And it's a war of technology. You start out the war with the lessons of World War I. So the moment war is declared, Britain convoys its ships, brings all of its ships into organized groups, shepherded by sheepdogs, which are corvettes and frigates, and destroyers, light, small warships designed to protect the merchant ships from submarines. The lifelines for Britain is from the United States and Canada on the East Coast. They gather at Halifax, Nova Scotia, American and Canadian convoys, and they steam across the North Atlantic to Liverpool in England. Now, these convoys are equipped with sonar. Sonar, or what the British call ASDIC, is a sonic principle similar to radar radio waves. You have an underwater speaker and microphone. The underwater speaker, boop, hits something metal, boop. There's a return, there's a listening device, and by pulsing out the sound and figuring out what direction, how long, what the sound of the return is like, if I'm an experienced sonar man, can figure out where the enemy is, what the enemy is, how big they are, how fast they're going, what their course is, and so forth. So the British think they have an advantage. We've convoyed our ships, we've got sonar. Germans who attack us underwater are going to be hit by our depth bombs because we can locate them with sonar. But the Germans had also been learning from World War I. Admiral Dönitz, who is the commander of the German submarines, has only a few dozen submarines at the beginning of the war because Germany had spent a lot of resources building battleships. Had they been building submarines, Britain probably would have lost the war. But Dönitz intends to attack the ships on the surface, not underwater, at night with what are called wolf packs. With radio in Germany, Dönitz is able to coordinate the various U-boats into little flotillas called wolf packs. As a convoy approached, the wolf pack would move into its path. And the timing of the attack would be at nighttime, preferably on a moonless night or a night with foul weather. What the German submarines would do is on the surface where they're more maneuverable, maneuver in and among the British ships if they can get past the escorts, and start sinking them with torpedoes and with gunfire. ASDIC, or sonar, doesn't work on surface ships, not well anyway. Radar has problems actually at the surface too because of all the bounce back from the waves. So this actually began to work. Also, the Germans had air power from France that helped vector in the submarines. The British had radio listening devices to help vector in the submarines. So the Allies realized this isn't working with wolf packs. What we need is air power. Aircraft can sink submarines more effectively than anything else in World War II. Today, submarines can sink submarines. But how do we get aircraft with range long enough to cover not just the coast of North America, not just the area around Iceland, which is taken by the Americans, not just the area near Britain, but the mid-Atlantic gap where no aircraft can reach? How do we do this? Well, the British and the Americans start putting single fighter aircraft on merchant ships' decks. The fighter aircraft will be launched with the assistance of rockets, usually a Hurricane. Go into the air, sink a submarine with bombs, shoot down German aircraft that are scouting, and then the pilot hits the silk, jumps out, parachute, and the plane ditches in the sea and sinks. And hopefully the pilot gets picked up. Think about that as your job description. You get into a plane, get shot off a deck, fight in the air, maybe try to sink a submarine that has guns that can shoot back at you, by the way, if it's on the surface. And then you've got to either land your aircraft in the ocean and climb out, or jump out of your aircraft while it's flying and hope your parachute works, and then hope somebody will come pick you up. That is a dangerous job. Soon, this battle of technology was in the Allies' favor. As we develop longer-range aircraft and deploy longer-range aircraft, we cover the entire route of the convoys. With Allied air supremacy, the U-boats had more and more of a need to go underwater. And at this point, in 1944, the Germans developed the Type 21 U-boat, which is a U-boat designed not to operate on the surface with occasional bouts underwater. This is a U-boat that has a different power system, far more batteries. It's actually faster underwater than it is on the surface. And it has what's called a schnorkel. A schnorkel is like a snorkel when you go swimming. You got a little mask, you got a breathing tube. That's a snorkel. Well, a schnorkel is a breathing tube for the submarine. It provides air for the crew. It provides air for the engines, which diesel engines need. And this submarine is going to be able to function underwater in a way no submarine has ever before. Luckily, the war ends before the Type 21 boat is built in large numbers. But I hope you can see the back and forth of technology and of tactics. Ultimately, in early 1943, the Germans were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. They were sinking more tonnage than, even with America's factories, we could reproduce. But by the middle of 1943, the Allies had built better long-range aircraft. We had merchant ships with actual flight decks where planes could take off and land on the ship. And our systems were better, and there were never enough Type 21 boats to make a difference at the end. So the Allies win the Battle of the Atlantic and win the war. Next time, we will go into other turning point battles at the turning of the tide in World War II. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? I see none. Haley, is that a question?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Come again. By the way, I voted.